So we move on from the rational model to the political organization and think about the political organization, the political model of the business. How do we think about that? How do we analyze it? Well, we analyze it based on three basic issues: power, who has it, who doesn't have it, and how is power used; rights, who has rights and who does not; what are the duties and obligations we have to each other; and then, of course, within the context of what is fair or just, and of course, where you are in the hierarchy, what is fair to one is not fair to another. And this is the original position, the issues that Rawls talks about, right? Where if I might consider something fair, but the person below me doesn't necessarily think it's fair, and then what's below them may not be fair. It's like the food chain. If you're at the top of the food chain, everything is fair. If you're in the middle of the food chain, some things might be fair and others might not. And if you're at the bottom of the food chain, nothing feels fair to you. And that's typically what happens if you go back to that hierarchical organization. Those at the bottom are constantly where they are in the food chain at the lowest part of it, and aspects of that doesn't feel fair. And so the structure of the organization is not, the power isn't always based on the hierarchy. It's often based on clusters. For example, in some industries, you might find that research and development is an incredibly powerful part of the organization. And in other parts of the company, other countries, for example, it's not R&D that's powerful. It might be manufacturing that's powerful. And in other companies, it might be marketing or finance that has more power, or operations that has more power. So power isn't uniformly set in necessarily in that hierarchy that we talked about. It can be anywhere depending on the industry, the type of products or services that we produce, and sort of historically where the power lies and has traditionally lied in the organization. And it is important for us to recognize this. When you walk into an organization the first time you're working for it, you should sniff out where the power center is in your company. Who has the power, who doesn't? Who has the influence, who doesn't? I used to work at an organization where it was clear that the marketing department had tremendous power and sway and influence over anything that the CEO did. And other departments had an impact, but not like the marketing department. And yet I've worked in other areas where the computer programmers and the IT, because it was a software company, of course, had tremendous power. And they're the ones that drove the decisions and what got done and what got walked away from. So it was sort of interesting to see how that would play out. So power is in a network of relationships, and networks of people, and the coalitions that get built, right? I mean, we've all watched, reality TV where they talk about coalition building and things like that. But the point of coalition building is we join forces to have more power and resources and benefits and influence. And when you have a strong and powerful coalition, you can get the resources you need, you get the benefits that you want, and you can influence the process the way you need to. So this graphic, you know, looks at that hierarchy that we talked about before, but actually shows you where the power flow is, and how in some departments, in some areas, some people have more power than others. And you can see where the coalitions are being built among certain board members and certain VPs in the company. It's the VP of research likes the plant manager on the left. That plant manager on the left, is not fond of the one in the middle, but likes the one on the right. And all those arrows are representations of power dynamics that occur in the organization. And it's important to try to figure as much of that out as you can where you're at in the hierarchy, to know how much influence you have and how much power you have to be able to influence people. So let's talk a little bit more deeply about the political organization. Let's start with the employee rights and the similarity argument. And the similarity argument is talking about four basic features A government is defined by four basic features, and it's mimicked, right? That similarity. It's mimicked in business organizations. Number one, that there's a centralized decision-making body of officials, which we saw in our hierarchy at the top. That the officials have recognized authority to make and enforce decisions. That the officials determine the public distribution of resources, benefits, and burdens, and the officials control the power exerted on the subordinates. Those same features exist in business organizations. So employee rights come from the structure, but also the power dynamics in the company. And it's those people that have the power, the centralized source of power based on their position, that that is what guides employee rights. My rights are only based on where I am kind of in the hierarchy, and what my position dictates I'm able to do. There are some certain employee rights that we should be considering. Um, well, actually, before I go to that, let me finish up. I realized I didn't finish point 8.22. The difference between the government and the business organization is largely, obviously, the government has a lot more control over things. There's less mobility. There's more limits to what we can do. Business organizations have a little bit more flexibility in terms of those kinds of things, but bureaucracies, we use it as sort of a bad word, like, oh, it's bureaucratic nonsense. But the bureaucracy is actually not a bad word. It's only when it's abused it's a bad word. But a bureaucracy is about having predictability in the reporting relationships, and knowing what somebody can and can't do, and knowing the scope of their responsibilities and not having them go beyond that. And that is one of the basic rules that you follow based on those structures, right? So the political model, the business organization, it follows the same sort of notions, right? But it has more mobility and more and less limits, and better situation in that context. So in terms of those rights to privacies, the people have the right to determine to what, to whom, and how much information about themselves should be disclosed to others. And so employees do have a fundamental right to privacy in the workplace. The only time that there is no presumed privacy is when they on their computers, and if they are driving in cars using company resources. You use a company resource, there is no privacy. But there is privacy in a bathroom. There's expected privacy there. But what information gets shared? I don't want my neighbor to know that I have an HIV status. I don't want my neighbor to know that I have a disability. I don't even want my CEO to know that. So the HR director in the company who may be privy to this information is not really allowed to share that private information with people because of HIPAA requirements. And so employees do have absolute privacy in terms of information personal to them, who it gets shared with and why. So I'm there to do a job. I don't need to give you any more details about myself if I choose not to. Now, technology, the use of technology, the use of computers, the use of phones, the use of cell phones, the use of company cars, the use of company phones, even, keystrokes on my computer, software that will monitor what I'm doing. These start to chip away at our rights, but the Supreme Court has held that we don't really have, privacy rights, when we're doing the business of the organization. So if we are stealing time from the employer and not not doing the work that we're supposed to, if we are using the company resources to access, oh gosh, like anything, right? Like access porn sites or surf the web, or post on my Reddit site or my blog, I don't have a fundamental right to privacy in terms of technology and how it will monitor when I'm doing my job. And there are some fine lines where that stuff gets drawn. So there are two different types of privacy. There's psychological privacy and physical privacy. And psychological privacy we honor, quite strongly, and physical privacy to an extent as well. Like psychological privacy, people don't need to know what's going on in my thoughts, my emotions, outside of the scope of my job. Physical privacy, again, no one has the right to see my body underneath my clothes. It's not appropriate for the workplace, et cetera, et cetera. We also need to consider, information and collecting information that may threaten the right to privacy. We have to be incredibly careful about what we ask of people. For example, when we asked people to tell us about their status for COVID, whether or not they were positive on the COVID tests during the height of the pandemic. A lot of employers were asking about that information. And to be perfectly honest, under the law, no one was obligated to provide that information. Legally, you can't ask them medical questions. But we were relying on people to be honest about it, and to say, I have an issue and I am going to quarantine myself and not let people know, and not get other people sick. I mean, what happens in a pandemic really calls into question a lot of these employee rights to privacy, because the public health demands, oftentimes, and it's a Supreme Court, ruling on this from 1905, that talks about how important it is for us to often set aside individual liberties in times of public health crises. And so that's a consideration. But generally speaking, HIPAA controls what private information can be shared and asked for. And people cannot be compelled to give information about their personal selves without consent. They cannot be compelled to tell where they are driving in a car without consent. Now, if you know that your car has a GPS on it and you choose to drive it, then you know that by driving it, you are consenting automatically. But the employer needs to let you know that they're monitoring you like that. And then obviously, your responsibility is either to accept that or to walk away from the job. And we need to be reasonable in how we collect information on people. We don't want to be intrusive. We don't want to be going after someone's private information on their private phones or their private computers. But it is a consideration, of course, and a concern. The right to freedom of conscience, which is our next point below. What is that freedom of conscience? It's that I should not be compelled to do something that goes against my conscience, that I believe is to be morally wrong. And that's the whole point of having whistleblowing, where the whistleblower comes in and makes a statement about what is something is right or wrong. They report it to the appropriate authorities, and that gets addressed by whoever the authority is. We have the right to be protected from whistleblowing, and to not be retaliated against because of it, right? So if you're an external whistleblower, a little bit different than an internal one. Obviously, the four justifications for external whistleblowing are as follows: that there's substantial evidence of present or future wrongdoing, moral wrongdoing. There are reasonable, serious internal whistleblowing attempts were made. So individuals within, the company were not responding to you, that you made an effort to report it to the chief ethics officer, the CEO, that something wrong was going on. So if no one is reasonably listening to you, you have the right to go outside of the boundaries to do external whistleblowing. And it's also justified if we know the external whistleblowing will prevent it from happening. Now, there are limits to who we can talk to when it comes to external whistleblowing to be protected. Like, you can go to Congress, you could go to regulatory agencies. You don't go to the media. You don't go to Anderson Cooper or Wolf Blitzer or anybody like that. You go to reputable agencies that have legal authority. You can go to the police. You can go to regulatory agencies. And we also need to consider the consequences to ourselves and our family and others, by the whistleblowing, recognizing, they have to be justified for the moral wrong, because there's always going to be backlash if you're a whistleblower, 100%. What is the employee when is an employee obligated to become a whistleblower? Um, they are obligated to become a whistleblower, number one, when that person has a moral duty to prevent the wrong, either because it is part of the professional responsibilities, like an accountant or an environmental officer, HR professional, or because no one else can or will prevent the wrong in which the company is involved. So it's either part of my ethical obligations, and my code of conduct for my profession, or because no one else is going to do it, so I got to do it. And then number two, the wrong involves serious harm to society's overall welfare. It could be, obviously insider trading or things like that, because that affects the community. It could be pollution related issues, criminal related issues. There should be a serious injustice against a person or a group and a violation of the basic moral rights of people.